Ways and Means, still the name of our committee, still the 21st, 11-ish, and we are going to take a look at a floor amendment to S-127. Representative Kimball, do you want to share any context? You don't have to go up there.
No,
No, unless you want to.
I do.
Okay. Terry, you too. Wow, so formal. I love it.
Switch roles sometimes.
Okay.
Morning, for the record, Charlie Kimball, representative from Woodstock. Hi, nice to see you. Representative. So there are, back up for a second, after the caucus of the whole on Friday, in which we discussed the current amendment from House Ways and Means to the House General and Housing Committee amendment to the report from the Senate of S-127. A group of legislators met to try to find a path to get more support for our amendment and also make it to address their concerns. So what we put together, there are 5 proposers of the amendment. Those are Representatives Marcotte, Branning, Mahaly, myself, and Kornheiser that are on this amendment that is being offered. There are some, to just give you a high level view, and then Ledge Council can take us through what those specifics are. The first that you have seen this amendment is a change of the definition of middle income, swapping out from that to be mixed income, talking about housing developments that are mixed income in order to qualify for that higher increment of the 80%. It doesn't specify what exactly mixed income is, but the idea is that it would incorporate low and moderate and middle income developments. So the second is the purpose has been expanded from what you have seen before. And that is to encourage the development of new primary residences for households of low and moderate income across both rural and urban areas of all Vermont counties. That was something that a lot of our constituents or a lot of our fellow representatives wanted to make sure is that CHIP was going to be applied across the entire state, not just in certain geographic areas. So that's in the purpose section. The next is the approval process. It gets rid of the CHIP board as a separate entity, but instead incorporates 3 new members into VEPC for those CHIP project decisions. And that are 2 voting members, the executive directors of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency and the Vermont Housing Conservation Board. And then 1 is the commissioner of the Department of Housing and Development or Community Development that is lodged within ACCD, a non-voting member because they serve under the same umbrella as VEPC does organizationally. It also requires VEPC to make a decision within 45 days of having a completed application. There was concern expressed about the process is going to take too long. So that's really one of the things there. And the next part is to eliminate the location criteria. This is just a small sub B, but probably the largest change for the entire proposal is that instead of having CHIP be dependent upon within the same language, location criteria, it is to consider them totally separate. Separate the financial tool from what's allowable in different areas of the state for development. Let them 2 be different. The cap is $40 million still, but it does give VEPC the ability to apply to the Joint Fiscal Committee for an additional $5 million in approvals if they find that it's necessary. Next is to task VEPC with developing rules that make it easier and more explicit when administering the but-for test. So it can be squishy when you're talking about VEGI applications, Vermont Employment Growth Incentive, but it can be a little more prescriptive when you're talking about whether or not a development is going to occur because the financial stack just doesn't pencil out. So hopefully VEPC can develop that test to be easier to administer. It then changes and also responds to some concerns from fellow legislators, the word blight in terms of the rules to be administered to vacancy and dilapidation. So it's to try to just be more specific about the properties, about the projects you're trying to prioritize. Last, it extends a sunset review of statewide TIF to be the same as CHIP, December 31st, 2031. This makes it co-terminate so that there's a wholesale review of the intersection between CHIP and TIF, what's working, what's not working within that 5-year time period. So that's the basic changes that are in the S-127 amendment.
Thank you. I appreciate all of the work you've done to help the body understand what our Ways and Means Amendment was and finding some clarifying language. And I'm happy to co-sponsor this amendment with you, Representative.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's been an interesting journey. And I hope that we can get the body to pass it, because this is one of the opportunities that we have to actually pass project-based TIFs. I did share with the Rural Caucus a fair number of numbers. It's S83, H129, S33, and H642, which are all proposals in former legislative sessions for project-based TIF, and none of them made it. So this is a different deal.
Thank you. John, do you want to tell us the details?
Morning, everyone.
Morning.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I've basically already had my work done for me, so that's always nice. But I will show you in language what you just heard. So for this amendment, what you're seeing is not a strike all. It's just proposing to strike the CHIP sections of the bill and replace them so that folks can read all of the CHIP sections together in this amendment. The first change you're going to see is in the definitions section. We're going to be on page 3. Yeah, I believe. No, I don't know. Page 4. So just changing from middle income housing to mixed income housing, not a substantive change, but perhaps a more accurate description of what is being applied here, right? You're getting a development that has 20% provided to a particular income level, and the remainder may not be. The purpose section is our next change, and this is on page 5. So the purpose is to encourage the development of new primary residences for households of low and moderate income.
Do you want questions now or at the end?
Now it's fine.
So again, you said it's not much of a change, but can you explain the difference between mixed income and middle income?
Yeah, just for kind of connotations of the word or what you might think of these capturing. And it's actually helpful for me to scroll to the purpose to in part demonstrate this. So previously with the purpose section, we've discussed a purpose section that would have been develop new primary residences for middle income households, right? That would have been households of a particular income level. Mixed income is literally multiple income, right? So households would not be of a particular income level in a household wouldn't be mixed income, but a development would be mixed income, meaning that you have multiple levels within a development. A middle income target is specific as to a particular income range and may not pick up, for instance, low income, right? So if you wanted to do a project that targeted the lowest, the most affordable kinds of projects, you wouldn't think of that as middle income, whereas mixed income is more agnostic as to the targets of that. So you could target a mixed income housing development to a low income household. You could also alternatively target it to a moderate income household or a middle income household. So I think it aligns more with the flexibility that was already inherent in this approach. And it's just a more accurate description of what it's doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't understand in the next one, in 13, where we talk about the mixed income housing development needs to be at least 20%. 20% of what?
The units. So it's how
Right.
many units within the development are subject to an affordability constraint.
Is that what, it says at least 20% of the units are mixed income housing units.
That's right. Am I missing a question?
I'm missing how that identifies that 20% should be either low or moderate or whatever, because we're just calling it mixed.
Yeah, what is required is that 20% of the units be housing that is subject to a housing subsidy covenant of perpetual duration. And you can target that housing subsidy covenant to different income levels based on what the municipalities want to do. But you have to provide a minimum of 20% of units subject to this housing subsidy covenant of perpetual duration.
So the rest could be market housing.
Exactly. And in no concept has there been a requirement that an affordable housing development be 100%.
But it could
Right.
also be, it could also be very affordable housing potentially, but
Yes.
just not subject to the covenant.
Exactly. It's a flexible approach. Yep.
Right.
So another way to say it is if you wanted to do 100% of your units to mixed income housing units, you could do it. It's just that to meet this
Right.
incentive structure, at least 20% needs to
It
be.
needs to meet the housing subsidy covenant.
Yep. So we were talking about the purpose section before. The real substantive change here, which Representative Kimball called out, across both rural and urban areas of all Vermont counties. So making clear this is a program meant to target all areas of the state. Unless you think that this is purely a rhetorical change, note that the purpose section is picked up in a couple of places, like people have to make a determination that this meets the purposes of the subchapter. So this would factor into that analysis. The next changes are in section 1910, which is your application section. And that begins on page 8. A lot of the changes here are things that you can't see because they're deletions, right? So the CHIP board has been removed. You'll recall we had that process where VEPSI was to make recommendations to the board and then the board would sign off. You now have that concept removed. You've retained the before test. The biggest change, as noted by Representative Kimball, is that preceding the project criterion on page 10, we used to have a location criteria section, and that is pulled out, meaning that this just speaks to financing and projects could happen in any area of the state. On page 11, you're seeing a lot of highlighting, but it is not as much, it's not indicative as a big a change as it might seem to be. This moved an earlier subsection where VEPSI was making a recommendation to the board to be at the end of the process. So we've seen everything, all the steps that a municipality has to go to. And now we talk about the approval process. And the real changes you see here are VEPSI should approve or deny that application not later than 45 days following receipt of a completed application. So if someone submits an incomplete application, it doesn't start that clock, right? And then standard provisions here, you have to meet the requirements of the section, approval of the tax increment financing plan, and then you see that your application deadline for CHIP is December 31, 2031. So a little pushed out. You also see on the limit provisions here, we've maintained that $40 million figure, but you now have the ability for VEPSI to increase the limit by not more than $5 million upon application by the governor and approval of JFC. And then there's specific things that have to be considered. So in evaluating that request, JFC should consider economic and fiscal conditions of the state, including recent revenue forecasts and budget projections, and VEPSI to provide testimony, documentation, project application data, any other information JFC requests to demonstrate that it will create an opportunity for the creation of additional housing to meet the needs of a muni or the state.
So welcome.
Could you clarify your intent here? Because is this 5 million total or is this 5 million in every year operation?
It's 5 million is available to be applied for every year, and the intent is that there is concern in the body that I think partly because what the $40 million stands for is somewhat confusing for folks, that it was not enough money for the amount of housing that is anticipated to be built. And so this is a way of saying, if in fact this is oversubscribed in the way that some people anticipate, then there is flexibility. There are also lots of people who think that probably not because of anything Ways and Means did, but because of the nature of the universe, that it will not be oversubscribed, but.
And so the decision was to approve it preemptively rather than to revisit next year and see whether it was oversubscribed.
It's not approved preemptively, it's just the possibility of approving by JFC. Representative Kimball remembers when we've done this before with Veggie, and it was actually turned down by JFC at that particular time when we did it with Veggie, but that doesn't mean that that's what would happen in the future with this. It's just, it is a process that we have used before for other tax credit programs.
Yeah, so the way this is written, would it be in 2 years, they apply for and they get funded? So let's just say, for sake of argument, that happens in 2028. In 2029, would the limit stay at 45, or would it go back down to 40?
40. I will say, I agree that the language that is listed here is drawn from, this is the same way that it's worded for veggie, which is, I believe, a 1-year approval for these purposes. And I would just note that if the intention was to make this permanent, I don't think you would do it through this process of an application and approval each year. You would just outright change the statute.
Yeah, and I understand that that's the intent. I just want to make
Yep.
sure these words say that.
I agree that you could say more, but this is exactly the way that it's worded for the veggie approval.
So this is all still to be used for infrastructure, right? Not the building and the kitchen and all that, it's infrastructure.
Right.
It's underneath the ground or on the ground. And also, why do we need the but-for still in there?
I think that our responsibility is to, kind of, curious for your thoughts, our responsibility, especially in this committee, but I think generally as legislators, is part of our responsibility is to protect the purse of the state. In this year, particularly the education fund. And if development would happen without state dollars, why would we use state dollars for that development? And that's all it is. I think one of the things that Representative Kimball mentioned when he was sitting over there in the witness chair is I've heard concerns that the but-for test is going to add extra paperwork and complexity. One of the things as the bill came to us before we had our first amendment, and I think probably as originally sponsored, there's this agreement, as it came over from the Senate, there has to be sort of a contractual agreement between the developer and the town in order for this to go forward. That has to go to VEPC anyway. That paperwork is really all that VEPC would need in order to determine whether or not the but-for is valid. And so there's no extra paperwork required by the but-for test. It's just saying, are these state dollars actually useful to this process? If yes, they will be used for that process. If no, you don't need them. That feels very straightforward to me, but maybe I've just thought about it too long and too circularly. Representative
That
Burkhart.
makes sense. The pushback I feel like I'm getting from some smaller towns or municipalities is it feels nebulous as to whether our project would be approved. And it's having lived for us to go through the approval process, even for TIP. It's less complicated than TIP, but we still don't have a ton of capacity at the municipal level. And will smaller towns be frightened off from trying? I'm not arguing against the but-for. I think I like the but-for being in there. I just think that's the argument that I'm getting. And I don't know if there's been any thought or discussion.
And I'm, in the amendment language that we're walking through, we're asking VEPC to further clarify how the but-for test will be used, and maybe that will provide the clarity for municipalities to feel more comfortable. But the whole CHIP concept is a lift for anyone. It's not, I think Representative Holcomb has made that quite clear through this process. Yes.
You chose it. I wouldn't have chosen CHIP. They could have done a grant program, chose the hard one. But your question, actually, Representative Brannigan's question raises a question for me, which is something that was actually put to us in the cafeteria at the table the other day. Can CHIP be used to build bike trails?
Let's scroll up to the definition of improvements and find out.
Because I think the restrictions are taxpayer protections. I'm just curious what we're allowing.
I don't see that here. I know that earlier concepts had public recreation as one of the list of improvements. But I don't see that among these options. And note that this is an exhaustive list of the sets of infrastructural improvements.
Where are you reading?
I'm on page 3.
You're looking at 2 right there.
Yep, exactly. I mean, trying to think creatively here. Could someone do site preparation along those lines? Maybe, I don't know. I don't think that doesn't seem to capture it to me. But 2 is where you would typically look for that kind of.
In the same way, while we're on that line, in the same way that you've named development and redevelopment, Does construction include reconstruction? Implicit?
So I will say that when I first drafted this, that was the thinking, is why have the words construction and reconstruction? Reconstruction is a kind of construction. The fear, I think, is that folks who are accustomed to a program that has that language, construction or reconstruction for TIP districts, and sees new language that doesn't say reconstruction, might take that to mean that it's specifically excluded. But this is the language we're talking about, installation or construction. One of the questions that was raised this morning in House Commerce was, isn't effectively the rehabilitation or reconstruction of infrastructure automatically construction? Because when you're putting in wastewater, you are putting in new line, right? Like people are putting in new things at that point. You have to take out old stuff and replace it with something new. So I don't think that this is a dangerous area to be in. And if it turns out to be, you can fix it. It's easy to fix.
Thank you.
So just one other thing on the but for, since before we even introduced the draft of the amendment, that a number of members had suggestions on tests for the but for test that I had received. I would say about 5 different volleys, if you will, as to what about this language? Maybe we could do this. And that's why we've asked BEPC to really have a thorough look at what is the appropriate but for test that could then be more easily and explicitly managed by VEPC, and also municipalities and developers could clearly see more easily what they're going to have to do to prove the but for.
Maybe I'm just shaped by the fact that the town of Hartford, South to me, just found out it had 86% latent grand list growth in the last 8 years. The report that we've gotten that our grand list is growing despite any investments in infrastructure. Is that something that came up in the context of the but for discussion that you had with people?
There were discussions on proving the lack of investment that had occurred in that particular community. There were discussions about whether or not the financing was sufficient that was available to support it. And then there's questions about if the financing available would make it affordable or still unaffordable. So there are all those different suggestions that were made as to the but for test, not for the background market appreciation of it. But it was really geared towards what other things to use to analyze whether or not that development would occur. Because even in those communities where there has been substantial market appreciation, there hasn't necessarily been new investment in infrastructure or buildings.
Sometimes there is. But I guess my question is, I'm thinking about rural areas that want to see development. When we look at the Killington TIP, for example, the TIF was 1/3 of the public investment in that program. So it's hard to know some growth there with that additional investment. Now we're, adding 1/3 to the investment of the state in CHIP on an annual basis. Some communities can pull in that cash and some people can't. I don't understand how this is going to increase development in areas because it's not targeted. It depends on local capacity to leverage in, local monies and local capacity to actually complete the application, as opposed to, say, a grant program that you could target at places that you knew needed help. So when we're making 1/3 more investment, did people talk about whether in the out years, I understand they want the money now. That's again why a grant program would have made sense, but did they at least talk about if we're going to increase this by 1/3 for 5 years, whether we want to evaluate whether the most efficient and equitable area, way to do that is through this particular program as opposed to another tool. I feel like we're using a fork to cut meat.
I think some of the essential questions about if CHIP is the most effective development tool for the state to use have come up in the context of the Ways and Means Amendment. But they are essential questions about CHIP and not essential questions about the work that we've done with amendments in this committee. And I think they're going to continue to be discussed through many years. There's no magic single program that's going to give our struggling municipalities capacity or build all the housing that's needed. It's going to need to be a suite of tools, and some of them are going to work better in some places and some of them are going to work better in other places. I do know that in some of the conversations we had in drafting the amendment, we discussed the continued need for technical assistance for towns. And And that's an important layer to put on top of all of this, but that's sort of a different project. What else do we have here in the amendment?
So the next thing you're going to see is just a cleanup change. This is non-substantive related to when the housing development site terminates. So that's on page 13. What you see on line 5, the housing development site shall continue until the date and hour the indebtedness is retired, or if no debt is incurred, the debt incursion period ends. What this previously said was 5 years following creation. We just wanted to make sure that this aligned with subsection A, which is you have 5 years in which to incur debt. That's your debt incursion period. But you can receive this 3-year extension. So we wanted to make sure that you weren't prematurely terminating the housing development site. So it also just makes sense substantively to have the whole description of how the housing development site terminates in one subsection rather than split across 2. So I think this is just a clearer way of saying what was already in the draft. The next change is to the rulemaking section, and we've already hit a bunch of this. Scroll down to I'm on page 21, bottom of page 21. And heading on to page 22, broad authorization for rulemaking to VEPC, and then specific directives. Previously, we had developed methods for prioritizing applications that take into consideration particular factors, including blight. That's been updated to reference vacancy or dilapidation. And then this last piece, this is the main piece we've been discussing in the rulemaking context. A specific directive to supplement the but-for test, giving due consideration to any rulemaking that has been undertaken to supplement the but-for test under Title 32. So what has VEPC done in rulemaking to build out the but-for test it conducts for TIF districts? Take that into consideration in how you build out the but-for test here.
So in the previous version, there were a couple of paragraphs of just
Yes.
examples of but-for, what the kind, not examples of but-for, but what the things would be considered. That's been removed and we now.
We still have the but-for test that's in place. So we have the same but-for test language in section 1910. It's in
Okay.
section, in the application section.
Okay.
It's subsection B, and it's exactly as is done for TIF districts. And what this is saying is build out that test. Think about the ways that you've built out the test in the past, but you still have a definitive but-for test in statute. This isn't tasking VEPC with creating a new but-for test, right? You have that in section 1910.
In
I can
this
show, yes,
particular
and I can,
version?
yes, and I can show you the page if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Just a
That would be helpful.
second.
Because I was looking for.
It's not highlighted as part of, and it is on page 8, and I've got it up on the screen now.
Okay, yes, that's what I'm thinking.
Yep, so page 8, section 1910, it's part of your core application process.
Thank you.
The other piece, I think, Paul, we discussed this before, but we previously had a requirement for draft rules to go to JFC for approval. That would potentially take longer, right, to conduct. That provision of the rulemaking section has been removed, so there's no longer a requirement to submit draft rules to JFC for their review. VEPC can do its rulemaking process and just needs to make sure that it specifically says these 3. It can do more. The next change is to your membership of the VEPC board. With the removal of the CHIP board, we wanted to maintain some of the housing expertise, and what you see on page 24 is for the VEPC board, which is an existing board, right? Adding exclusively for purposes of reviewing and approving housing infrastructure project applications under CHIP, the council shall additionally have 2 voting members. So that's the executive director of VHFA and the executive director of VHCB, and as a non-voting member, the commissioner of DHCD, Housing and Community Development. So
This is not a dig on the Commissioner of Housing and Community Development. It's that VEPC sits at ACCD already, and so did not want to create an inadvertent conflict of interest sort of within the bureaucracy there.
and these are exclusively for the purposes of the CHIP program, right? They're not going to be touching veggie or other things that flow through the VEPC board. The last change is to your TIF sunset, and you can see that on page 27. The council shall only approve under this section applications for tax increment financing. And this is for TIF districts. This is existing Title 32. This is not the CHIP program. those submitted prior to December 31, 2031, same date as you saw for the application deadline for CHIP. So I think Representative Kimball explained the rationale behind that. And that is the full set of changes in this amendment.
Yep.
Representative Kimball, was there any discussion? I know another issue is a lot of folks are talking about in the definition of the continuing sections is still not electrical.
Yep.
Any reason why that's not in there?
We've taken some testimony in this committee that that electrical should not be included in the list of improvements. So and we took some other things out of the list of improvements when we passed this amendment out. So it didn't change it from when we passed it out as a committee before. So it really remained the same that way, and to be applicable for all those things would be considered pretty standard for any development of those primary infrastructure policies. We did add, if you remember, digital and telecommunications infrastructure, so that is in there. But we didn't, because the utilities at the time, when we took testimony, was about the utilities generally having access to capital that they could use to apply to different projects or infrastructure. So that was.
I know that's still an issue. What about the 65% of the floor space for housing? That's still in your.
It is. There's no change in that.
No,
And I know-
that's.
And there are people pushing for a 51%. And this really makes it a priority for housing projects, you know, not just enough to qualify as a housing projects, but really prioritizes it that.
I know that their argument is, though, that in particular in rural areas, you may need more area for the project to work as far as, you know, if you can't build 3 stories high,
Yeah.
you know, to make a project work, they may need a little bit more of retail space or whatever it may be.
If those applications come in that way, Vepsi, I'm sure will let us know and we can change it in the following year.
Yeah.
Any questions for John? Thank you, John. Thank you for all your work on this bill. Thank you. You say no problem?
I said goodbye.
Oh.
but-
That makes way more sense.
Y'all still need me in the room, that was wild. So-
Oh, no. Thank you. Any discussion, anything anyone want to share before we do a straw poll?
Yeah, it's the, but for
Mhm.
the cat, perpetuity language with them. We're gonna have problems going forward.
Mhm.
But this amendment, I think, does make the bill better. So I'm gonna.
Thank you.
I also plan to vote yes here in committee. I want you all to know that I continue to be concerned about the ed fund and using the ed fund for anything other than pre-K through 12. That's, I mean, I've been fighting that battle for 20 years and I'm not changing on that. I appreciate how she gets the point.
I feel like investing in this housing infrastructure is one of the most important responsibilities we have right now. But if you had told me when I walked in, and I've said this before, that we would be raising property taxes to fund housing, I would have not believed this legislature. So I'm having a really hard time with that. I also feel like we have a responsibility to taxpayers, particularly in this cost burden environment, to use our dollars as efficiently and effectively as possible. There are many tools in our drawer. We picked one that is burdensome and inefficient, and I understand that. I can't say no to housing, but I really feel like we didn't do our job as effectively as we could, and I have a real problem with that. I'm extremely concerned about this, not just on its own, but also in the context of the fact that we used $120 million to buy down tax rates for 1 year. So we've already set our education system up for a huge spike. And on top of that, we don't know what's happening on education in 454. And so making this decision out of the context of those, I don't know how I can explain this to people back home. I really don't. So I have to say that. And it is very frustrating because I don't think, I've been told over and over by developers that if we put in the pipes, if we build the stormwater, the municipal water systems, they will build the housing, and it will be housing that people who want to put down roots and call our communities home can call it home. I know that grants are how we make sure those rural communities, people have been talking about Greensboro. The people there actually want these investments because that's how, not rental housing, but housing where people can raise their families gets built. And so I hope we can continue to work. I hope we can revisit this as a tool because I think there are better ways to meet those needs. So sorry, and thank you for listening to me.
So I certainly appreciate your efforts, working with others. I saw those concerns, quite a while ago and expressed them to the chair as well. I believe that there's going to be maybe another amendment as well, with some concerns from the rural caucus as well as Vermont League. So, we can hash those out if and when they come before us. But again, I think this is some needed improvement, and so I'll be supporting it.
You else? Yeah.
Yeah, not to argue explicitly, I disagree. But I've watched project-based TIF efforts come and go in ways and means. And this is by far the best. And I also think with regards to housing, which is something we need to do, it supports all of our agendas in terms of supporting families, growing the grand list. I mean, there's a whole long list there. So I'm sort of saying this is the best project-based TIF we've seen by far, I think. And yes, there will be an impact on the ed fund, but we need housing in order to grow the grand list to improve the ed fund. And so this bill is something I can clearly support. And I also thank those who worked on this amendment because I think it assuages a number of the discomforts that have been out there for other people. And I can go on about that, but you don't need to hear from me right now. So thank you.
I think I really like this amendment. I think that, in balancing the need for incentivizing housing development with the concerns that we all have about the impacts on the ed fund, I think that this amendment specifically was very well crafted to balance and put reasonable guardrails around a tool that is very controversial. And I don't want to imply intent, but I do feel as one of the few renters who serve in this body that incentivizing rental developments is just as important as full property ownership. When we talk about wanting to free up housing stock for seniors who want to downsize or keeping more young folks in Vermont, I think that crafting it so that 65% of the project has to be housing, it can go either way. I think that that's really important.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Representative Kimball, for really extraordinary amount of work to get the whole body's head around what tax increment financing means even. So thank you. Okay, with that said, let us do a straw poll, please. And maybe if you could read our names rather than the show of hands.
Rather than the show of hands today? Okay. All right. But we're still going with, we don't need a motion because it's.
Don't need a motion because it's a straw poll.
Okay. Changing rules and make sure that I'm not waiting for that one. Okay. Representative Brannigan.
Yes.
I'll vote yes as Representative Burkhart. Representative Feltes? Yes. Representative Higley?
Yes.
Representative Holcomb? Yes. Representative Kimball?
Yes.
Representative Maslin?
Yep.
Representative Bodie is absent today. Representative Wazazak?
Yes.
Representative Canfield?
Yes.
Representative Kornheiser?
Yes.
We have voted amendment or straw poll amendment favorable 10-0.
Thank you very much, everyone. We don't have anything scheduled after the floor today. But there is some, who knows what will happen? Please pay attention to your phone and sort it out. Thank you.